Hi everyone! Learning about tea takes a long time. It can take decades. And yet, despite all the experience you can acquire, all the knowledge, there are topics on which people will never agree. And so when I meet experienced people in the tea industry, tea professionals you could say, there are a couple of topics that I'd like to discuss. And so today I will present 5 of those questions or controversies, as you could say. First, Gushu is the only pu'erh worth buying. A lot of people believe that only the tea made of ancient tea garden material is worth tasting, worth collectioning, because they will say the small trees, they taste really bad, people use pesticides and everything. And I disagree with this because you see, the age of the tea trees, it's true that generally the older the tea trees, the better the taste. Usually in a tea made of old trees, you get less astringency, more endurance, usually more depth. You can feel the tea flow through your throat. It gives often what we call huigan, so that feel of freshness in the throat, and that's very enjoyable. But the age of the tree is just one of maybe 4 main factors that would contribute to that taste. And the 3 other factors would be the soil, the microclimate, so some natural parameters, then maybe the varietal, which is also important. So that would be 3 main characteristics that, along with the age of the tea trees, really define the taste of tea. In some famous areas, in some prestigious areas, you can have really good tea, amazing tea, made of plantation material or made of young tea trees. So, for example, my favorite area is probably Laomana or the south of Monghai, you know, from Hekai to Bulangshan, going through Banzhang and all these areas. All the tea that grows there is really magic. It has a lot of power, a lot of that depth and complexity. And some other areas, in some other areas you might find some very big tea trees, but which taste a bit weak, a bit flat, without much complexity. So, but I would say generally in a given area, it's true that the older the tea trees or the bigger the tea trees, the better the taste most of the time. Now that difference between ancient tea gardens and what they call Gushu and Taidi, so Taidi is like terrace tea plantation, it was much more obvious 10 or 15 years ago, because at that time you really had 2 systems of production in Yunnan. You had the traditional ancient tea gardens, which were managed without pesticides with a low yield. And you had the plantations which were mostly built in the 1990s, and in which they would heavily use pesticides and fertilizers so that the leaves grow fast. And the problem is, when the leaves grow fast, they don't have time to build up all the polyphenols that we enjoy through the tasting. So it's true that at that time there was a clear difference between the Gushu and the Taidi. But in 2010 or 2012, around that time, there was a big movement among the government in Yunnan to implement the Shangtai system. So it's a new way of managing the gardens, and that's what we call now natural tea gardens. And the idea is to take those plantations and convert them, use the same method that we use for the ancient tea gardens to manage them. So basically they are managed in the same way, without pesticides, without fertilizer, with not so much pruning. You can let the tea trees grow a bit. And the only difference would be the age of the tea trees. And after a couple of years it gave really good results. So I would say the difference now between old trees and young trees is a bit smaller than it was before, when we didn't have that Shangtai system. Second, handmade tea is better than machine-made tea. And this is where the real debate starts, really, because this is an opinion that can be shared among tea shop owners, but also on the factory floor. You have a lot of people with a lot of experience in Monghai who will tell you that machine-made tea actually gives better tea than handmade tea, because you can better control the quality. You don't rely on the skill of people, but more on science. It's more accurate in the way you make tea. It's more consistent. And it is true that using a machine to make tea gives you, at least you can more easily set the parameters. You can set the temperature, you can set the time, and you can control it better than dozens of people who would cook tea in a wok. But there are some drawbacks to the machine. First is it's true that you can control the parameters, but the tea is a natural material, and when you get the material, it's of a different water content. It might have different texture, different depending on the grade of leaves you get, or on the season, whether it just rained or not. You will have different fresh leaves, which means that if you really want the top processing, you need to adjust those parameters according to the material you get, and for that you still need an experienced tea worker. So that argument of not requiring much training for operating a machine doesn't really hold if you want to make really good tea. Now, the second problem, the second bias we have is generally the best teas, the best material will be processed by hand, because it's also a requirement from the market. When you pay hundreds of dollars per kilo for tea, most of the buyers will prefer when it's cooked by hand, by a guy who can cook. Okay, so if you look on the market, of course, if you taste the teas which were handmade, well, you've got that selection bias. It will, the trend will be that it comes from a better material than machine-made tea. So of course you will think it tastes better, but it's because of the material, not really of the processing. I rarely use the machine in our tea factory, but there are times when we have a lot of tea, for example, so it's good to have it as an option. In case we get too much tea to make by hand, we can start the machine and then we separate, because all the tea that we sell on our website is made by hand, at least the tea we make in Chiang Mai. Now for the cheaper teas on our website, some are made with a small machine, and but most of them, I would say 90% of those teas are made by hand. Now the problem is you kind of get complacent or get a bit lazy, because you see, when you're cooking the tea, you are engaged in the process, and if the wok is too hot, you will feel it immediately, so you will adjust naturally, because you have no choice. It's very obvious. But when you're just standing by a machine for hours on end, well, sure, you can adjust the parameters, you're supposed to check what's going on with the tea, but you don't feel the heat yourself in the machine, so it's very easy to have too much heat and not seeing that. And then we have the phone, like when you stand next to the machine, well, at some point you will tend to just start playing with your phone or chatting with people, and so you're just disconnected from the tea, and then the work of making tea just becomes a handling work, like you just put leaves in the machine, take them out, put some again, so it gets kind of boring at some point. And I think it's more likely to have mistakes made with the machine, even if you're competent, just because you're more easily distracted when operating the machine compared to when cooking by hand. Last argument in favor of why machine-made tea could be as good or better than handmade tea would be the progress in technology. You cannot really compare. We've had machines for maybe 20-30 years or maybe more, but they were quite basic. Now that Puerh tea is more expensive, people can afford also more technological machines or more advanced machines. And recently, maybe in the past 5 years, you've had a lot of sales of those small machines which are about the size of a big wok, in which you can put the leaves, and which is much more advanced, which offers more control. So you have lots of parameters you can adjust, and it's supposed to imitate the taste of handmade tea well. There's a wider variety of processing styles you can make with this machine. And so when I say that the cheaper teas we sell are made with this machine, this machine, we tend to prefer it. Like we don't really like the tea that's made with a big machine, because it can only give you one kind of processing style, you could say. Yeah, so that debate, and then of course you have the more philosophical debate of is there a value, an intrinsic value in having handmade tea for the beauty of the craftsmanship and things like that. Maybe that's more of a thing for the market to consider. But yeah, you cannot ignore that, because it's clear that the market for high quality tea is also requiring handmade tea. Yeah, so that's the second controversy that you can think about and discuss with your friends. Third, processing matters a lot for a good Puerh tea. Now this gets more and more controversial, because I think most of people would say, of course it matters, that's why we train in making good processing and things like that. But on the other hand, after having drunk, I don't know, thousands of different teas made by different people with different techniques, and you figure that they just display different characteristics. And I feel it's especially true for Puerh tea, maybe not so much for oolong tea, for example, but in Puerh tea I would say 80% of the quality is given by the raw material, you know, and the remaining 20% you could argue it's given by the processing, but you could also say that processing is just a style. And when you buy tea from different vendors, you will notice that vendors tend to stick to different processing styles they like. For example, we tend to like the Puerh tea on the green side. I think it gives a more vibrant tea with more presence in the mouth, something more dynamic. But some people might prefer redder processing with a lower amount of kilgreen, shorter cooking time or lower temperature, and then it will give maybe a bit more thickness, it will give a different array of fragrances. But in my opinion, something, well, more soft and mellow, so less dynamic, less punchy. So it's really a matter of taste, actually. And so this is good, because this is what gives each brand its identity. It's the house style, you could say, the processing. But personally, I don't think it matters too much in the end in determining whether it's good tea or not. But to be sure, a lot of professionals you will meet will have a very kind of narrow-minded, very strict standard in terms of processing. And it can be confusing when you start your journey as a tea maker, because you meet different tea buyers and you feel that they all want to teach you how to process Puerh tea properly, and they are very confident in that processing technique, but in the end they are all saying different things. And you need to understand by yourself that, okay, you can let them talk and understand what they mean, but it's just a matter of taste in the end. Now you could also argue that some teas age better than others, but again I would say a strong or soft shaching, kilgreen process, it also affects the way in which the tea will age. Softer processing tends to age faster because you destroy less of the enzymes, and I think if you remain within certain limits, it's all viable for aging. You will just end up with different results, which make the world of Puerh tea even richer. Fourth, Puerh tea gets better with age. While the tea ages, its aroma changes. The bitterness and astringency tend to turn into sweetness and that camphor feel, that freshness. So you would think that Puerh tea actually gets better with age. But there are also things that young Puerh have and old Puerh tea doesn't have. For example, the punch, the bitiness. Okay, so aged Puerh tea tends to have more wisdom, but some people might prefer a more aggressive tea, more punch really. Have a tea that maybe says something in a louder way, you could say. Now, a lot of people, especially the older Puerh tea drinkers, in terms of how long they've had tea, so the traditional markets like Guangdong, Hong Kong and Taiwan, they will tell you, don't drink young Puerh tea, you will hurt your stomach and you will die horribly. Now, I've drunk young Puerh tea for maybe 15 years or more now, and I'm still alive. But it's a very common saying, I think, in traditional Chinese medicine, that drinking young pu'er makes your body cold and it will hurt your liver. So since people really believe that, most of those people only drink old tea. But you could go back in time. These people have had pu'er tea for a long time, and it's true that in the 90s it was all plantation tea during the 90s, and the gushu stopped being harvested in the early 90s when the plantation came, and it only got famous again, the ancient tea garden tea, in around mid-2000s. Okay, so all the tea you get in the 90s is from plantation tea. And it's true that when it's young, it doesn't taste so good. Even if you buy some big factory tea nowadays, like buying some Dai, if you try the young tea, it's pretty harsh, it's quite hard to drink. So the vendors, of course, will say, oh, but it's a tea that needs to age. Yeah, but to me, it's a bit of an argument. Just it's a way of selling bad tea. In my opinion, good tea should taste good from its young age. And if it improves with age, it's a plus. But I would say, in my experience, personally, I think when tea ages, you get a different fragrance, you get a softer profile generally. Sometimes you can get more chachi, so that would be really an improvement, but this you only get in really old tea, I would say 20 plus years old, and preferably with a wet storage. So it comes back again to the traditional drinking areas where, yeah, those old teas can be really impressive in terms of chachi, because you've had lots of microbial activity in the cake. But for most of the semi-aged tea you might find on the market nowadays, I think it's just a different tasting profile. You cannot really say it's better, because personally I really enjoy the dynamics of the young tea, and I would say I have maybe 80% young pu'er and 20% old pu'er. But so it's a matter of preference. Is aging pu'er tea a good investment? Now that gets a little tricky, of course. If you look at the past 20 years, you could say it's been a good investment in the past 20 years, because if you bought a tea 10 years ago, since then the price has increased a lot. If you look at the market, the 10-year-old tea cakes are not always more expensive than the tea from this year, and it's simply because the price of the fresh leaves has increased a lot in the past 10 years, and even more so in the past 20 years. So those people who hoarded pu'er tea back in the 90s got really, really rich now. It was an extraordinary investment. Okay, but you could think this is like saying, was it good to buy Apple stock 20 years ago? Of course it was, in hindsight, but it doesn't tell you about the future. This was a good investment because the price of the fresh leaves was increasing. So another question will be, will the price of the fresh leaves keep increasing? Since the start of the COVID, we've seen that the price have been quite frozen, or sometimes even in some mountains they tend to decrease. But we don't know, is it just a short freeze of the economy that will only last 5 years, or is it a more profound change in the economy, and China will be like Japan with like a very stable and not growing economy for 20 plus years? So the questions on whether it's worth it or not, you need to investigate this. Okay, will China continue to grow? Will the price keep increasing? If you keep it, if you make it even pricier, it will really be a truly luxury product, not really accessible to the middle class. And then you'll need to check the spending habits of the elites, because you could also argue that if the real estate market collapses, then all those upper class people, where will they invest their money? Well, they might turn into some alternative investment, like buying jade, buying pottery, and maybe buying tea. So it could actually lead to a second wave of speculation and price increase. Okay, but let's even imagine that the price of the fresh leaves doesn't increase. I just said in the fourth question that there's a whole category of Puerh tea enthusiasts who will only drink aged tea, which means that turning young tea into aged tea is actually adding value to the tea, because you make that tea accessible to a new range of customer, a new market. The price of aged tea tends to increase by 10% maybe every year. I think that's a fair price increase. But now if we figure that the price of the fresh leaf remains stable, maybe we'll only be able to increase by 5%. You also have to look at the competition, because now in China a lot of people are aging tea. So maybe if too many people are aging tea, maybe that investment is not worthy at all, actually, because even though it costs you to store tea and there is a risk associated with your tea turning bad, there are so many people on the market compared to the demand that you won't be able to sell at a higher price. Finally, another danger could be that overall there is maybe more supply than demand, and the problem is with Puerh tea being able to age is that it leads to speculation, and if you have more production than what people drink every year, it means that every year you have a bigger and bigger stock that accumulates. Now, a lot of those investors in Puerh tea, they don't make money by selling tea. They invest the money they make. Let's say you're a banker or you're a property land developer or something, you make a lot of money and you just buy Puerh tea as part of your investment strategy. Then it means that a lot of people do this, and if for some reason there's a need for these people to get money now, they will all want to sell the tea at the same time, and there will be a crash in the Puerh tea price. But you could also think that what would lead people to want money now, it would be maybe a kind of economic contraction, and in this case a lot of other investments would lose their worth. So you would need to compare what's better. Is it better to invest in the real estate market in China, or is it better to buy Puerh tea or to buy on the stock market? And of course this leads to complex financial analysis. Also, you have to look at the liquidity of this asset, because you cannot sell your tea as easily as a stock. So investing in tea probably means that in the future you will have to open a tea business in some way, and usually that's what rich people do. Maybe they work in the construction, and then when they retire they open a tea shop, or they have lots of friends who want to buy tea. So yeah, if you invest in Puerh tea with the hope of making money, you need to think of a plan on how to distribute it afterwards. Now, I would say small-scale investment, it's more like a bet, I would say. If you're a tea enthusiast and you think this tea is good and you think it's going to age well, I would recommend you buy a tong, just to store at home and drink in your old age. It seems that the older you get, the more you prefer aged Puerh tea. So it can also make sense to think that you're going to age your own Puerh tea. It's a kind of personal investment. Maybe now you're in your 30s and you have some money, you just buy a few tongs of cake, a few tongs of Puerh tea, and that way you know that whatever happens when you'll be old, you will be able to enjoy that aged tea without paying the price for 30 or 40-year-old Puerh tea. Yeah, so that's the 5 controversies that you can think about today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching and see you later. Bye bye.